Imagine coming to work on a normal day, and your boss starts humiliating you just because you don't fit into his stereotypes. That's exactly what happened to our hero. But the manager doesn't suspect that there's something much bigger behind his back. This employee is not who he seems. What do you think will happen next when the truth comes out? Hi, friends. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. We really want to get to know you better. You are incredibly important to us. Every like, comment and view helps our channel grow and inspires us to create even more content. Each of you is not just a viewer, but a part of our family. Thank you for your support. We appreciate it more than you can imagine. The day began with a little excitement. The black suit fit perfectly, the fresh shirt felt pleasantly cool on his skin, but his heart was still beating a little faster than usual. He stood in front of the doors of a large corporation he had heard a lot of good things about, getting ready for his first day of work. His name was Marcus, and this was his first serious job after university. Marcus walked confidently into the office, trying to ignore the tense looks he immediately felt. His colleagues, long accustomed to the measured rhythm of the office, looked at the newcomer with curiosity and at the same time with some caution. Marcus couldn't help but notice how their glances ran over his dark skin and appraisingly lingered a little longer than they should have. He took a deep breath and headed to his workstation, trying to focus on the tasks ahead. All he needed now was to prove himself professionally and not let external factors throw him off track. After all, he didn't come here to be liked by everyone, but to show his skills and earn respect through work. However, despite his efforts, the atmosphere around him was filled with an underlying tension. Whispers behind his back, barely noticeable nods in his direction, all this became a background for Marcus that was difficult to ignore. Marcus had already settled into his workplace when the manager entered the office. The man with a short haircut and a cold, assessing look stood out among the employees with his energy, but there was a certain threat coming from him that Marcus could not explain. At first glance, he looked successful and confident, but there was something else in his manner of communication: disdain. The manager paused for a moment at the door, scanning the space, and his gaze fell on Marcus. His lips pursed in a contemptuous sneer, as if an unpleasant obstacle had suddenly appeared in his path. A moment later, he turned, heading for his office, not paying a word to Marcus. "Hey, you!" the manager suddenly said loudly, without turning around. "You're new, right?" Marcus, slightly taken aback by such an abrupt address, rose from his chair and came closer, trying to collect his thoughts. "Yes, my name is Marcus. I just started working here," he answered, trying to sound confident. The manager turned and looked at him carefully, as if trying to figure out what he could possibly be interested in. His cold gaze seemed to be ripping Marcus apart. For a second, Marcus felt vulnerable, as if he was on display. "I hope you're not planning on doing anything stupid here," the manager said dismissively. "This is no place for incompetence. Make sure you do it right." Marcus felt irritation rise in his chest. He was determined to show that he could handle any task, but the manager's words, full of contempt, pierced his heart like a sharp knife. "I will do my best to live up to your expectations," he replied, trying to remain calm. The manager just nodded, not paying attention to his words. At that moment, Marcus realized that his hesitation and indecision had become the object of ridicule, and he could not afford to give in. From that moment on, he realized that in the office he would have to face not only tasks, but also bias. As if confirming his doubts, the manager continued, "Well, I hope you can handle the tasks. And remember, I will not tolerate any negligence. Everything here is based on results. It is not where you come from, but what you can do that matters." The words sounded like a death sentence. The moment the manager left, Marcus felt the oppressive atmosphere of the office tighten around him. He returned to his desk and opened his computer, but his thoughts were full of contradictions. How could one judge a person so easily without knowing him? Would he really be ridiculed just because of the color of his skin? The anxiety did not leave him, but Marcus knew that he should not allow these fears to take hold of him. In this world full of bias and prejudice, he was determined to prove that he was worthy of a place in this company. With new challenges and purpose, he focused on his work, knowing that he had a long way to go to gain the respect of his colleagues and especially his boss. The office was bright with morning light, and everything seemed routine until the manager, an arrogant man with a sharp gaze, walked into the room. His name was Mr. Henderson, and his mere presence instantly changed the atmosphere. As if on cue, his colleagues tensed, Their conversations died down, and everyone returned to their screens, trying not to attract the attention of their boss. Marcus, who was completely focused on his first assignment, did not immediately notice how the manager approached his workstation. Mr. Henderson stopped right in front of him, and his shadow fell on Marcus's monitor. Looking up, Marcus met the cold, impenetrable eyes of his boss. "Who are you?" Henderson asked, without a trace of a smile, looking Marcus up and down as if he were some kind of defect in a perfectly fine-tuned system. His tone was sharp, almost insulting. "My name is Marcus. Today is my first day." Marcus tried to answer politely, feeling an unpleasant chill run down his spine under the manager's gaze. Henderson continued to look at him as if wondering how the man had gotten there in the first place. His gaze was too frank, too dismissive, and Marcus immediately sensed that the man was not in a friendly mood. "First day, then," the manager drawled, the corners of his lips twitching slightly, but it was definitely not a smile. "I hope you understand that no one is going to help you here. You either get the job done or you leave. I don't want to deal with newbies," he continued, casting one last glance at Marcus before taking a step back. Without waiting for an answer, Henderson turned away almost demonstratively, as if he had accomplished something insignificant, and began to glance around the rest of the office. It was as if he had forgotten Marcus's existence immediately after that short, humiliating conversation. But for Marcus, that moment had been important. When Henderson finally headed toward his office, Marcus sat back down, but his mind was now far from his work. His hands were shaking slightly, and his mind was pulsing with the thought of why the manager had jumped to conclusions so quickly. It seemed to him that he had just encountered obvious hostility, and it was painfully obvious. The colleagues sitting nearby pretended not to notice this unpleasant conversation, but Marcus felt their eyes on him. No one dared to intervene. No one said a word of support. The feeling of isolation began to hang over him like a black cloud. There was a bias in Henderson's eyes, not only towards him as a new employee, but also for other reasons, more hidden, but already familiar to Marcus from previous years. As much as he tried not to think about it, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just his rookie status. The color of his skin clearly played a role in the manager's reaction. Henderson hadn't even bothered to introduce himself properly, hadn't tried to get to know him better. All he'd done was dismissively judge him from the first minute. That meeting with the manager stuck with Marcus more than anything else that day. It was the first crack in his hope that working for this company would be fair and equitable. Several days passed in nervous tension. Marcus tried his best, delving into new tasks and demonstrating maximum professionalism. He arrived at the office before everyone else, stayed until late in the evening, trying to show that he was ready to work to the fullest, but an uneasy feeling did not leave him. Every time Mr. Henderson passed by, Marcus felt his heavy gaze on him. The tasks that Henderson assigned were difficult, but Marcus coped. At some point, it even seemed to him that the situation was starting to improve, that his efforts would finally be noticed and appreciated. However, the reality turned out to be much harsher. On Friday, as the workday was drawing to a close, Marcus was finishing another task. It was a detailed sales report for the last quarter, which he had been working on all week. He checked everything several times, trying to avoid the slightest errors. The document was sent on time, and he allowed himself to relax a little, feeling satisfied with the work done. But he had barely managed to lean back in his chair when Mr. Henderson's loud voice rang out throughout the office. "Marcus!" The voice was so sharp that all colleagues instantly froze and turned towards the manager. Marcus clenched his fists and stood up slowly, feeling his heart begin to pound. He knew he had done the right thing, but there was something ominous in Henderson's tone. "Come here!" Henderson stood outside his office with an open laptop in his hands, pointing demonstratively at the screen. Marcus came closer, and for a second it seemed to him that there was more than just displeasure in that look. It was a real challenge. "What is this?" The manager turned the screen around and Marcus saw his report. "Do you seriously think this is a decent result?" Henderson asked coldly, piercing him with his gaze. Marcus was taken aback, not understanding what the manager was talking about. "Excuse me, what do you mean? I double-checked everything. The data matches." But Henderson interrupted him before he could finish. "Data? You call this data? Seriously?" His voice was rising, getting louder and harsher. This report looks like it was written by a newbie who has never seen analytical data. Do you not even understand how to work with numbers? His face contorted with obvious disdain, and he took a step forward, closing the distance. Marcus froze. He didn't understand what was happening. The report was correct. He had checked it several times. There were no errors. Everything met the requirements that had been set. But now he was faced with a manager who seemed to be specifically looking for a reason to humiliate him. If you're going to continue like this, you might want to reconsider whether you should even be here. Henderson continued, his voice rising. He wasn't just pointing out mistakes anymore. He was speaking so that everyone in the office could hear. Marcus felt his colleagues' eyes focus on him. Some were sneaking glances through their monitors. Others were exchanging glances, but no one dared to intervene. He knew that no one would come to his defense, because Henderson was known for his autocratic management style. Everyone was afraid of falling under his hot hand. I did everything according to the instructions, Mr. Henderson, Marcus said quietly but confidently, trying to keep himself in check. Although inside everything was boiling, he knew that the situation was clearly beyond the bounds of reason. Instructions? Henderson looked at him with disdain. We have no place here for people who hide behind instructions. Marcus, we hire people with brains, who can think and solve problems, not just follow paper. I hope you'll understand that before I'm forced to take more drastic measures. The words sounded like an open threat. Henderson turned away from Marcus, making it clear that the conversation was over, and with demonstrative disdain returned to his office. Marcus stood motionless as the feeling of humiliation and injustice grew in his chest. He knew his report was perfect, but it didn't matter. The manager was deliberately looking for an excuse to humiliate him in front of everyone, and he found it, without the slightest reason, without any objective basis. Marcus returned to his desk under the intense gaze of his colleagues. They were silent, but their expressions spoke volumes. Some pitied him, some feared for their own skin. A heavy silence fell over the office, and Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The first nitpick, the first blow. Team meetings became a real challenge for Marcus. What started as petty nitpicking and put-downs soon turned into open disdain. Henderson found new ways to show his attitude towards Marcus every day, and one of these manifestations became especially noticeable at team meetings. The first meeting where Marcus was blatantly ignored took place in a large room with all the key people in the department. It was an important meeting, a discussion of strategies for the coming quarter. Marcus had prepared thoroughly, analyzing data and preparing proposals for process improvements. He had a whole presentation with ideas that could help the company save time and resources. He wanted to prove himself, show his value to the team, and take a step toward more constructive relationships with his colleagues. The meeting began, as usual, with Henderson speaking. He waved his arms, passionately talking about the company's priorities, his plans and ideas. Everyone listened, nodding, agreeing with every word, but Marcus could see that his colleagues were not convinced. Their eyes were doubtful, but no one dared to challenge the manager's point of view. When the time came for discussion, Marcus decided to speak up. He raised his hand to attract attention. I have a few suggestions for improving our process, he said calmly and confidently, receiving a nod from one of his colleagues. But he had hardly begun to speak when Mr. Henderson, without waiting for the end of the first sentence, abruptly interrupted him. "Oh, Marcus, thank you for the initiative," Henderson said with forced politeness, smiling, but his eyes remained cold. "But let's not get distracted by theories. We have real problems here. We need to focus on practical solutions." Marcus tried to continue. "My proposals are precisely about how we can increase productivity in the short term by changing." "Marcus," Henderson interrupted again, louder and more aggressive than before. "We've already talked about this. Focus on the tasks at hand. Okay? We're not here to waste time on arguments." An awkward silence filled the room. Colleagues glanced from Marcus to Henderson, their gazes tense. Everyone felt that the manager was being unfair, but no one dared to object. The air was stifling, not one where new ideas were welcomed, but one where all initiative was brutally suppressed. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with shame and anger. He couldn't believe he was being so openly excluded from the conversation. He had done everything he could to approach the discussion constructively, had spent time preparing, but all he had received in return was ridicule and contempt. Without even bothering to hear him out, Henderson had completely invalidated his efforts. The meeting continued, and Marcus sat silently in his chair. feeling the tension building inside him. Every new suggestion that came from other employees was received with enthusiasm by the manager, even if it was not well thought out. One of his colleagues suggested an idea almost identical to the one Marcus was about to voice, but Henderson nodded and said, "Yes, that's what we need. Great idea." Marcus had to stop himself from getting up and leaving. His emotions were raging inside him. He couldn't understand why the manager was treating him like this. It wasn't just about his ideas. It was about him, and it was obvious to everyone. From that point on, incidents like this became regular. Every time Marcus tried to speak up in meetings, Mr. Henderson either cut him off or pretended he didn't exist. Marcus would raise his hand, waiting for his turn to speak, but Henderson would ignore him and continue to let other employees speak. Even worse, he would nod pointedly at someone next to Marcus, making it clear that their opinion was important, not his. Every meeting was a torment. Marcus knew he had ideas and suggestions that could help the company, but whenever he tried to express his thoughts, he was simply ignored. The rest of the staff, sensing the growing tension, began to behave the same way. They no longer wanted to support him or ask questions about his proposals. No one wanted to end up in the same position as Marcus, because a confrontation with Henderson could only end in one thing: humiliation. Marcus felt increasingly isolated from the team. He felt trapped. His ideas were not accepted. His voice was not heard. Henderson's disdain became too obvious to ignore. Each new day at the office brought new disappointments, and he began to wonder, was it worth continuing to fight, or was it time to accept that he was the target of systematic discrimination? With each meeting, Marcus became increasingly aware that this was not just a random complaint about his performance. This was a deliberate, carefully planned campaign against him, caused not by anything he had done, but by who he was. The personal confrontation with Mr. Henderson came a few weeks after Marcus had first experienced the cold, almost hostile attitude. It had begun gradually, with small slights and dismissive glances, but now it had escalated into open displays of hostility. In public, Henderson tried to maintain the appearance of professionalism, hiding his true intentions behind a thin mask of arrogance. But behind closed doors, the situation had changed dramatically. There was no longer any need to pretend. One evening, after most of the staff had left the office, Mr. Henderson called Marcus into his office. It was dark inside, except for a desk lamp that cast a dim light on the papers scattered across the table. Marcus walked in, feeling the tension build and his heart begin to beat faster. He tried not to show his emotions, although a voice inside him warned him that this would be an unpleasant conversation. Henderson sat at the table, arms folded across his chest. His face was irritated, but there was something more in his eyes: hidden anger, a desire to humiliate. When Marcus closed the door and sat down opposite him, Henderson began talking immediately, not bothering to say hello. "Listen here, Marcus." His voice was cold and hard. "I'm getting pretty tired of dealing with you and your pathetic attempts to show off. Let's be honest, no one wants you here." Marcus tensed, trying to maintain his composure, but Henderson's words hit him where it hurt. This wasn't just a nitpick about the job. It was a personal blow. "I can see how hard you're trying," Henderson continued with a sardonic smile, "trying to be smarter than you are. But let's be honest." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes blazing with malice. "You think you have a future here? That you'll be given a chance to grow in this company?" His laugh was loud and rough. "Do you really believe that?" Marcus was silent, but inside he was seething. He knew that his work was not to be criticized, and that his suggestions were reasonable and worthwhile. But now it was clear, Henderson was not attacking his professional qualities, he was attacking him as a person. "Let me explain something." Henderson leaned back and folded his arms, narrowing his eyes slowly. "You don't belong here. I don't know how you even got here, but let's be honest, your level is something like service personnel, not an analyst at a big corporation. You're probably used to working somewhere." His eyes flickered over Marcus's face, and he continued with poorly concealed contempt. "Some kind of dirty work. This is out of your league, kid." These words hit Marcus harder than any criticism of his professionalism. This was no longer about his work or his skills, it was a direct attack on his person, his background and the color of his skin. "I'm always surprised when people like you show up in places like this," Henderson added mockingly, not giving Marcus a chance to get a word in. "Seriously, you think that just because you came here, you can be on par with us? That you'll be treated as an equal here?" Marcus felt his insides clench with anger and humiliation. He knew that this wasn't just a man who was unhappy with his work. This was a man steeped in prejudice, who genuinely believed that Marcus's place wasn't in this office, but somewhere much lower on the social ladder, if not lower altogether. Henderson's every word was filled with malice and disdain, and that was clear. "I can only imagine how you feel, sitting among normal people," Henderson continued with a smile, noticing Marcus's fists clench. "But let me give you a piece of advice, don't try too hard. We all know who you really are, and we know that the place you occupy is not yours by right. It is not yours by nature." At that moment, Marcus felt his patience exhausted to the limit. He could no longer remain silent, and his voice, despite his desire to remain restrained, sounded firm. "I'm here for the same reason as everyone else. I work and try to contribute to the company, and the color of my skin has nothing to do with it." Henderson laughed harshly, loudly and without a trace of humor. "Do you really believe that it works like that? That you'll be judged on your own merits?" He shook his head. "I guarantee you, people like you will never be equal to us. You can pretend not to see it, but the truth is, you're a nobody. You're just an extra, temporary element, and if you haven't figured it out yet, you will soon." The manager's final words were like a final judgment. Marcus knew that this conversation was more than a personal attack. It was a signal that this office would not allow him to rise, would not allow him to prove his worth. Henderson didn't just despise him for his job, he despised him as a person, and he was doing everything he could to show it. Marcus left the office bitter, but with a clear understanding, the situation had moved beyond professional disagreement to deep racial prejudice. Henderson was no longer hiding his attitude. He was openly showing that he considered Marcus inferior, less worthy, less important than anyone else in the company. But Marcus wasn't going to give up that easily. Every morning Marcus began with a heavy feeling, as if he had an impossible burden on his shoulders. As he approached the office building, his pace slowed, as if instinct told him that another day of humiliation and endless nagging awaited him behind those glass doors. Things had only gotten worse since the conversation he had had with Henderson behind closed doors had turned to outright hatred. Henderson did everything possible to make every new day in the company a torture for Marcus. It was no longer just a normal work process with professional tasks, it was an exhausting battle, where they tried to break him psychologically, and then physically. The manager deliberately increased the volume of work, loading him with the most minor and unpleasant tasks. Every morning began with a pile of mail, a list of tasks that seemed meaningless and clearly exceeded the capabilities of one person. "Marcus, I need you to finish this report by the end of the day." Henderson's voice came from above his desk, cold and uncaring. "And don't forget about the archived documents that need to be reviewed. By the way, I asked you to work on this report for the supply department. Don't forget about it." Marcus was having a hard time containing himself. He had already had to do work that was, in essence, far beyond his job description. At first, these were small tasks, such as checking spreadsheets or compiling reports for other departments, but gradually it turned into a stream of meaningless tasks that did nothing to improve his productivity or development. Every day became an endless marathon, where he was the only runner, forced not only to do his job, but also to pick up everything that others did not have time to do or did not want to do. His colleagues seemed to notice, but no one dared to intervene. Their eyes were sympathetic, but also fearful. No one wanted to face Henderson's wrath. No one dared to openly support Marcus. This only increased the feeling of isolation. Left alone with his humiliation, Marcus felt himself sinking deeper into emotional and physical fatigue. "And don't forget about last week's report," Henderson added casually, glancing briefly over Marcus's shoulder. "It was done horribly. Fix it and make it right." "But I already fixed it," Marcus countered calmly, remembering that he had spent the entire evening making edits to the notes Henderson had sent him. He had even forwarded the report to the manager with notes that he had double-checked everything. "Fixed it?" Henderson turned and leaned over him, his voice filled with icy mockery. "You call that fixing it? Do you really think you can do a good job? Do you even know what you're talking about?" Every time Marcus heard such words, his patience was seriously tested. It was hard for him not to react to provocations. He knew that Henderson was deliberately trying to push him to the limit, to make him lose his temper and thereby prove his case. After all, if Marcus could not stand it and give in to his emotions, he could be fired for cause. That is why he clenched his teeth and, despite deep fatigue and despair, continued to work silently. The working hours dragged on endlessly. The number of tasks Henderson dumped on Marcus seemed to grow with each passing day. Reports, adjustments, documentation, archive checks, responses to requests from other departments, all of it fell on him like an avalanche. He often stayed in the office late into the night, long after the rest of the staff had long since gone home. The light from his monitor was the only thing that burned in the dark. Empty office. Marcus stared at the documents in front of him, feeling his eyes begin to ache and his head spin with fatigue. But he couldn't stop. If he failed to cope with the volume of work even once, Henderson would take advantage of it and destroy his reputation once and for all. Sometimes Marcus would come home barely able to stand from fatigue. His hands would shake from the strain. His head would throb. Every day he felt his body giving in under the pressure. On weekends, he couldn't relax because thoughts of the upcoming work never left him for a minute. A feeling of hopelessness became his constant companion. The worst part, however, was not the amount of work, but the humiliation that accompanied each new day. Henderson did not miss an opportunity to go over Marcus personally. Every comment he made was filled with contempt and sarcasm. "Here's our specialist, late with his work again," Henderson said mockingly, passing Marcus's desk as he spent the third hour in a row trying to cope with the unbearably difficult task that had been assigned to him at the last minute. "I'm beginning to doubt that you know how to do anything at all. Marcus, how many times do you have to correct such simple mistakes?" he asked every time he found even the slightest reason to find fault. "Do you even understand anything about what you do?" Every word the manager said cut like a knife, but Marcus kept working. He couldn't let himself break down, couldn't let these humiliations break him. Leaving would be an admission of defeat, and Marcus wasn't going to give up that easily. Every day, he reminded himself why he was there, for his dream, for the future, to prove to himself and to others that he could do it. But Henderson knew how to push harder. The most unpleasant tasks, like working with dusty archives, which no one usually wanted to take on, were now permanently on Marcus's shoulders. While his colleagues were busy with more important and interesting projects, he was given assignments that were not only time-consuming but also unfulfilling. Archival documents dating back decades made little sense for his career advancement, but that didn't bother Henderson. He clearly enjoyed watching Marcus drown in these endless papers, gradually losing all sense of importance and respect. But despite all these trials, Marcus did not allow himself to break. With each passing day, his determination grew stronger, and deep down, a quiet confidence was born that the truth, sooner or later, would prevail. Marcus's situation in the office became even more unbearable when the manager, Mr. Henderson, began his public ridicule. Previously, the humiliation took place behind closed doors, away from the eyes of his colleagues, where Henderson could afford to show his hatred to the fullest extent. But now the situation had changed. Henderson decided to act even more openly and cruelly, bringing his attacks on Marcus to the eyes of the entire team. One of the first such instances was the morning meeting. Colleagues slowly filed into the conference room, taking their usual seats at the long table. Marcus was the last to enter, and as always, he took a seat near the end of the table, trying not to draw unnecessary attention to himself. He could feel some of the employees' eyes lingering on him a little longer than usual. They clearly knew what was coming. Ever since Henderson had started specifically targeting Marcus, people had been avoiding him. Marcus knew they didn't want to be the manager's next victim, which made him even more alone in this struggle. The meeting began with a discussion of the next work issues. Henderson conducted it with his usual coldness, but at some point his gaze stopped on Marcus and his eyes narrowed slightly. It was a sign, a foreshadowing that something unpleasant was about to begin. "Marcus," Henderson suddenly turned to him. Although a minute ago the discussion had been on a completely different topic. "Do you have anything to add about the report you prepared last week? The one you've already corrected 3 times? The manager's voice was full of mockery. A tense silence fell over the room, and all of his colleagues looked at Marcus. He knew the report had been done correctly, but he also knew that Henderson would not miss the opportunity to humiliate him in front of everyone. I think everything has been done according to your instructions," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice even. "You think?" Henderson repeated with theatrical surprise, pretending not to hear. "You think? You know, in this company we don't need people who think. We need people who do, and do it right the first time." Marcus felt his face begin to burn with shame. All eyes were on him, but no one dared to intervene. His colleagues were silent. Some of them shifted awkwardly in their chairs, trying not to look him in the eye. maybe you just don't understand how our system works," Henderson continued, addressing the entire audience. "I sometimes forget that people have different," he paused, then added sarcastically, "backgrounds. Some come from more advanced places, and some, well, let's say, from places where they're not used to such things." A nervous laugh rang out in the room. It was quiet, almost forced, but Henderson didn't notice, or rather, he enjoyed the fact that even this weak response confirmed his authority. Marcus understood where he was going with this, but he couldn't let it slip. Colleagues who had previously avoided open aggression now felt that their manager was giving them tacit permission to join him. Some giggled awkwardly, afraid not to join in the joke and risk disgrace. "Marcus," Henderson continued, grinning, "maybe you should go back to something more familiar." He looked at him with disdain. "You'd probably be good at some other job. Like in a warehouse, or in maintenance. They don't have such complicated reports there. You'll definitely cope." Marcus had to stop himself from responding to that. His hands clenched into fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. The feeling of humiliation and injustice was literally consuming him. He wanted to scream, to protest, to tell all these people that he was no worse than them, that he didn't deserve this treatment, but he knew that any sudden movement or word would only make the situation worse. Another burst of laughter rippled through the room. Some colleagues giggled even louder. Others simply nodded in agreement with Henderson. No one dared look directly at Marcus. They knew they were participating in something wrong, but they were afraid to speak out against it. "So, Marcus," Henderson pressed, his tone now more affected, almost affectionate, "do you think it might be worthwhile to try yourself in a different direction? Or do you still believe that you are capable of something here, among us?" Marcus didn't know what to say. In that moment, he realized how cruelly and purposefully he was being humiliated. This was more than just ridicule, it was a deliberate act of oppression, an attempt to strip away all his self-confidence, to make him feel like an outsider, unworthy of this place. But worst of all, it was happening in front of people who should have been his colleagues, partners, maybe even friends, but instead, they were afraid of being the victims of the next ridicule, so they simply laughed silently along with Henderson, supporting his cruel jokes. That day was a turning point. Marcus realized that he was now officially a target for ridicule and humiliation, not just from his manager, but from the entire team. Every move he made, every word he said, could be an excuse for a new round of bullying. When he tried to offer ideas or contribute to work discussions, everyone knew in advance that Henderson would not miss an opportunity to make a fool of him in front of everyone. The teammates, although they knew they were participating in something wrong, continued to laugh along with the manager. Everyone knew that if they did not support Henderson's play, they themselves could end up in Marcus's position. The fear of being ridiculed, like him, kept them silent and laughed at what should have been disgusting. At the end of the day, when the office was finally empty, Marcus sat at his desk, feeling tired and bitter. He couldn't understand why this had happened to him, and why none of his colleagues had stood up for him. He knew he deserved to be there, that his skills and knowledge were as good as anyone else's, but in Henderson's eyes, he was just a target for Henderson to use as a power play. This was more than just racism. This was a complete abuse of power and a cowardly play-by-play to those who feared for their careers. Marcus realized that there was no one left in this office who would dare to support him, and yet, he knew that no matter how hard it was, he would not let them break him completely. Marcus was struggling to cope with the mounting weight of daily humiliation and insults, but the day when his manager decided to drop him a subtle hint that his position in the company was in serious question became especially painful. That day, like many others, began with another wave of nagging and ridicule. Henderson, as always, watched his every move, with disdain in his eyes, as if waiting for another mistake to hit Marcus' self-esteem again. By mid-afternoon, as Marcus was once again immersed in a mountain of paperwork, a shadow appeared on his desk. He looked up to see the manager standing there, his face full of feigned regret that seemed almost worse than overt hostility. "Marcus," Henderson began, sighing as if he was about to say something heavy but necessary, "we need to talk." He pointed to the door of his office and, without waiting for an answer, headed there, forcing Marcus to follow him. Marcus felt his heart speed up and his palms grow clammy. Every time he found himself behind a closed door with Henderson, it ended in humiliation. But something in the manager's expression today foreshadowed something more serious. When the office door closed behind them, Henderson sat down at his huge desk and motioned for Marcus to sit down in the chair opposite. The manager rubbed his temples thoughtfully, as if collecting his thoughts, and then slowly began to speak. "You do realize, Marcus, that we're all results-oriented here, right?" he began, pointedly soft, which only added to the tension. "Everyone here is giving it their all, and I can see that you're trying." The last words were said with a venomous grin. "But trying isn't everything." Marcus remained silent, realizing that this was only the beginning. "The thing is," Henderson continued, his eyes boring into Marcus with an icy glare, "your effort is not enough. There's too much work, and you're expected to produce better, faster results." He paused to emphasize the seriousness of his words. "You're constantly falling behind, making mistakes, and frankly, your reports are a disaster." It was a blatant lie. Marcus knew he was doing a good job, despite the high demands and constant nagging, but Henderson always found a reason to criticize, and this was just another one. "We can't afford to keep people here who aren't up to our standards." Henderson's voice became harsher. "If you don't start working faster and better, I don't think you'll have a bright future in this company. After all, there are plenty of people here who want to take your place." Marcus felt a sense of helplessness growing inside him. Every word Henderson said was aimed squarely at him, trying to break him. This wasn't just a performance talk, it was a warning. A warning that if he didn't submit completely and start dancing to Henderson's tune, he would be fired. "I'll give you a couple of weeks," Henderson added, casting him a disdainful glance, "to show you what you can do, and if nothing changes, well, you know how it is." He leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper, but with even greater force. "We don't need anyone here who can't cope, and especially not anyone who doesn't understand their place." The last sentence sounded like a veiled threat. Marcus realized that Henderson was making a clear reference not only to his professional qualities, but also to who he was in the manager's eyes, a person who did not deserve to be there, a person who was taking someone else's place, and all this simply because of the color of his skin and the hatred that was hidden under a thin layer of professional politeness. Marcus couldn't say a word. He knew that any attempt to argue would only lead to more pressure. And yet, deep down, a determination was building. He knew that Henderson was being unfair. He knew that his words were just manipulation, an attempt to break his spirit. But Marcus wasn't going to back down. He was working for his dream and for his family. No one, especially not a man like Henderson, would make him go without a fight. "I'll do my best," Marcus said calmly, looking up at the manager. His voice was even, but a storm was boiling inside him. We'll see," Henderson replied casually, leaning back in his chair. "And remember, Marcus, I'm not disappointed twice. If something goes wrong, you won't have another chance." Marcus stood up and walked out of the office, feeling the cold sweat break out on his forehead. The pressure was mounting, and now his career was hanging by a thread. He knew this was the last blow before Henderson took more drastic measures, but in that moment, Marcus was determined that he would not give in. This wasn't just a threat to his job, it was a test of his strength and resilience, and though each day became harder, Marcus knew that if he could withstand the pressure, he would emerge victorious. Marcus was used to the constant stream of humiliation in the office, but it was one thing to endure it in front of his colleagues, and quite another to have it happen in front of clients. This was too much. That day, Marcus knew that the meeting with an important client of the company would be difficult, but he had no idea how difficult it would be. The client, a representative of a major partner, arrived at the office, and Marcus was tasked with preparing a report and presentation on working with this partner. He spent several days gathering information and preparing materials so that the meeting would be held at the highest level. Despite all the injustice he faced on a daily basis, he hoped that his professionalism and the results of his work would still be appreciated. At the appointed time, the clients arrived at the office. Marcus was nervous but confident, ready to demonstrate his knowledge and experience. Everything should have gone smoothly. However, from the very beginning, things did not go as expected. As soon as Henderson appeared in the conference room, Marcus noticed a cold glint in his eyes. It was a harbinger that the manager was going to take advantage of the situation to humiliate him once again, but this time in front of the company's guests. As Marcus began his presentation, Henderson immediately interrupted him. "Marcus, you know this slide is not prepared correctly, right?" His voice was full of contempt. He looked at the customers and added mockingly, "You see, Some of our employees here are not always able to cope with such tasks. I apologize for this small glitch." The clients looked at each other, slightly embarrassed. They clearly hadn't expected someone to criticize their employees so openly in their presence. Marcus continued speaking, but he felt his confidence fading with each passing second. He knew he hadn't made any mistakes in his presentation, but Henderson seemed determined to prove him wrong. "Let's take another look at that data," Henderson interrupted, leaning over the screen. "You see, this is some seriously weak analysis. I don't understand how this could have been allowed to happen. I guess not everyone understands how important this kind of thing is to our work." He paused, then turned to his clients. "We have people who do good work, but we also have people who, well, they take longer to learn." This was no longer just a hint. It was an open humiliation. The clients looked at Marcus with bewilderment and pity, and Henderson continued his speech, pretending to try to correct the situation. "Next time," he said with a smile clearly aimed at the customers, "I'll make sure all the data is accurate myself, so you can see the results of the work of qualified employees." Henderson's laugh was thin and icy, like a knife stabbing into his back. It was an open undermining of Marcus's authority in front of important people. In the eyes of these clients, he looked incapable of his tasks, an incompetent employee whom even his own boss did not consider worthy. Marcus felt his breathing quicken. He could hardly control himself. After this humiliation, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The clients began to act more distant, not looking Marcus in the eye, preferring to communicate directly with Henderson. Each new comment from the manager only added fuel to the fire. He repeatedly pointed out errors and inaccuracies that did not actually exist. It seemed that the entire presentation was now just an excuse for Henderson to make Marcus look bad. When the meeting finally ended, Marcus felt devastated. He knew he had done everything right, but it was not enough for Henderson. The manager had deliberately discredited him in front of his clients to destroy his reputation. Even after the clients had left, Henderson continued his attacks. "You see for yourself, Marcus, how it all went," he said with feigned regret, closing the laptop. "Such mistakes can cost the company dearly. I hope you'll be more careful in the future. If, of course, you ever have the chance." Those words were the final nail in the coffin of his confidence. Marcus knew that Henderson wasn't just trying to humiliate him. He was setting the stage for his dismissal. Every taunt, every nitpick was part of a strategy to push him to the point where his dismissal would be inevitable. As Marcus walked out of the office, he felt the weight of what was happening. The clients he had hoped to impress now saw him as a failure, someone who couldn't do his job. His self-esteem was crushed, and his future at the company seemed increasingly uncertain. But despite the gravity of the moment, a sense of resistance began to build inside Marcus. He knew this was all part of Henderson's dirty game, and even though he felt absolutely destroyed now, there was a growing awareness inside that he couldn't let this go on forever. After the humiliation at the client meeting, Marcus felt like he was under attack. His self-esteem was at its lowest point, and Henderson showed no signs of slowing down. Every new day at work was a real test. And now the manager began to resort to even more sophisticated methods to break Marcus' spirit. On Monday, when Marcus walked into the office, he could already sense something was brewing. Henderson had gathered his team for a morning meeting and, sitting at his desk, looked around at his subordinates. His demeanor was too calm to be sincere. "So, we have a new project," he began, his eyes flashing. "We'll need to prepare a detailed market analysis for our new product. It should be ready by the end of the week." The assembled colleagues looked at each other. The project was large-scale, and the deadline, to put it mildly, was too tight. But that was not all. And since we all know that Marcus already has some experience with such tasks, Henderson continued, ignoring the puzzled looks of the other employees, "I am appointing him as the lead on this project. Marcus, I assure you, you can handle it." Marcus knew that assignments like this took much more time and resources, but Henderson seemed to understand this perfectly well. He did it on purpose to make sure the project would fail, and then again accused Marcus of incompetence. "Given the scale of the task, I recommend you assemble a team and distribute responsibilities," the manager added with feigned concern. "But remember, we don't have time for mistakes." As if on cue, Marcus felt the tension in the room. His colleagues, who had recently been sympathetic to him, now exchanged glances full of doubt. No one dared to say anything. Everyone knew that Henderson would punish any mistake harshly. As always, Over the next few days, Marcus found himself in constant trouble as he worked on the project. The resources he had been given were clearly inadequate, and the colleagues he tried to work with were constantly being given new tasks by Henderson. The manager watched with pleasure as his plan unfolded. "I think we'll need to analyze this data in more detail," he said one day when Marcus asked him for help. "But unfortunately, we don't have time for that right now. We can't delay the product launch." Every time Marcus approached him with questions or requests for help, Henderson just waved them off, pretending to be busy. He clearly knew that Marcus was not coping with the amount of work that was thrust upon him. And then, when it came time to present the results, everything turned into a nightmare. When Marcus finally presented his analysis at a team meeting, he felt the entire room watching him with anticipation. Henderson was special. He looked like he was waiting for the moment to strike. "What is this?" he suddenly exclaimed, pressing his palm to his forehead as if suffering from a headache. "Do you really think that this data can be taken seriously?" Marcus felt his heart pound. "I collected all the available data," he tried to explain, looking at his colleagues, who began to whisper among themselves. "Available?" Henderson interjected, not letting him finish. "You're saying that we live in a situation where there are always not enough resources, and that, of course, is no reason to fail. How could you approach your work so irresponsibly?" Horror pierced Marcus. Each new rebuke from Henderson was like a blow to the heart. He watched as some of his colleagues turned away, trying to hide their smiles or sympathetic glances. "I think the question needs to be asked. How long are we going to tolerate this approach to work?" Henderson continued, raising the tension. "We need results, not excuses." Marcus knew that this had all been planned in advance, but it was too late to change anything. He felt completely helpless. Henderson used this meeting to finally assert his authority and show everyone that he was in control of the situation. "I hope you'll understand how important it is to work with what we have," Henderson said, sounding as if he had only the best intentions in mind. "Otherwise, we'll have to consider you looking elsewhere for opportunities." Marcus felt anger rise inside him. He knew this wasn't just a mistake, this was an attempt at sabotage, and Henderson was doing everything he could to make him look bad, and while he wanted to scream back, he knew that would only hurt him more. When the meeting ended, Marcus walked out of the room, feeling like his world was crumbling. He no longer had confidence in himself, his abilities, or that he would ever be able to handle this situation. But deep down, he knew this fight wasn't over, and he wasn't going to let Henderson break him completely. With each passing day, the atmosphere in the office became more and more difficult. Marcus felt his position in the team gradually deteriorating. After the latest humiliation in a meeting with the manager, colleagues he once considered allies began to distance themselves from him. This was not unexpected, but the realization that his support had disintegrated hit him even harder. At first, he ignored it, thinking that perhaps it was just a temporary situation, but it soon became apparent that many of his colleagues began to avoid interacting with him. They would quickly turn away when he passed, avoid conversation, or even deliberately seek out the company of others to avoid being near him. There was a tense silence in the office, and Marcus felt less like a team member and more like an outcast. At the morning meeting, which was usually a time to share ideas and discuss current tasks, he noticed the other employees exchanging glances as the manager resumed his nagging. Henderson continued to use him as a target, and no one dared stop him. Every new comment, every new joke made at his expense only reinforced the opinion among the other employees that they should stay away from Marcus. One day, when Marcus approached a group of colleagues to discuss the details of an upcoming project, his attempt was unsuccessful. They looked at each other, and one of them, Jake, laughed nervously. "Oh, sorry, Marcus. We have a discussion about another project here. Better wait a little." Marcus felt his heart clench. He tried to smile, but it was forced and insincere. "Nothing. I just wanted," he began, but his words were lost in the general comments. His colleagues were no longer listening to him, and the conversation continued without him. As he walked away, the same thought remained with him: how easily they had forgotten about unity and support. The emotional isolation he felt was becoming unbearable. During his lunch break, he decided to go outside to get some fresh air and get away from it all. But even outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him had become colder. People passing by looked at him with bewilderment, as if he were a stranger, and Marcus felt lonely even in a crowd. When he returned to the office, he noticed that his colleagues were discussing something funny again. They were laughing, but when he appeared, the laughter immediately stopped. It was unbearable. Marcus, depressed and tired, decided that he did not want to stay in this environment where he was humiliated and rejected. A few days later, once again finding that no one wanted to talk to him, he decided to approach Katie, a girl he had previously been on friendly terms with. But to his horror, she quickly looked away when she saw him approaching and said, "Sorry, Marcus, I need to," and she hurried away, leaving him with an emptiness in his chest. This was the last straw. Marcus realized that every time he tried to make contact, his colleagues avoided him as if he had the plague. Their fear of Henderson was becoming more and more palpable, and this feeling of misunderstanding and betrayal was weighing on him with each passing minute. That night when he got home, Marcus fell on the couch and closed his eyes. He didn't know how much longer he could take it. There had to be something he could do to change the situation. But how? Thoughts of just giving up and leaving the company swirled in his head, but he knew he couldn't give in. This wasn't just about his career. It was about showing that bias and racism couldn't leave him without a fight. Marcus knew that unless he took action, unless he put himself on the defensive, this situation wouldn't change. He wasn't ready to give in. He knew he had a right to be there, and if he had to fight for it, he would do whatever it took to stand his ground and regain the respect that had been taken from him. Each day had become increasingly unbearable for Marcus, but what happened on Friday was beyond anything he could have imagined. The morning had started as usual with work on the project, and Marcus, despite the mounting tension, was determined to do his best. He knew that the outcome was critical to his reputation within the company, and that his performance at the end-of-day meeting would be his opportunity to make a statement. But, as always, Henderson had his own plans. That day, the manager came to the office with special intentions. As soon as Marcus entered the conference room, he was met with icy silence. Colleagues hid behind their laptops, as if they had a premonition that something terrible was about to happen. The meeting began, and Henderson immediately turned to Marcus, pointedly ignoring the rest of the staff. "Marcus," he said sarcastically, "have you prepared the data for our project? I hope you are not going to embarrass us again." Marcus felt his heart beat faster. He knew he was fully prepared and he wasn't going to let Henderson ruin his confidence. "Yes, I have results," he answered, trying to speak calmly. Henderson continued without listening to him. "Let's see what you brought. Please don't let us down again. We can't afford another failure." Marcus stepped forward, ready to present his details, but before he could begin, the manager cut him off abruptly. "Let's see if you can do anything right this time," he said, sounding like he already knew Marcus would get it wrong again. As Marcus began to explain his findings, Henderson suddenly began to interrupt him, making him look bad in front of the entire team. "So you really think this will be useful? Do you seriously think you have any idea how this business works?" he shouted, causing everyone present to turn to look at them. Marcus felt his face flush. He noticed his colleagues start exchanging glances, but no one dared to intervene. "What the hell are you talking about?" Henderson continued, his voice rising in pitch. "You really think we need your opinion? Look at that guy. He can't even get the data right." Marcus froze in place, trying to swallow his shame and anger. He knew that if he didn't fight back, Henderson would continue to humiliate him. "I spent a lot of time analyzing it," he said finally, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "I've collected all the information I need, and I think it's important for our project." "Important?" Henderson laughed, and the laughter echoed around the room. "Everything you do is a waste of time. Not only are you unworthy, but you are also completely incompetent." Finally, Marcus' patience snapped. He looked the manager straight in the eye and said, "That's not true. I'm doing the best I can, and I deserve respect just like everyone else here." The entire room seemed to freeze, the shocked faces of his colleagues, some holding their breath, some trying to hide a smile, but no one was prepared for Henderson's reaction. "Respect?" he shouted, clenching his fists. "You don't deserve an ounce of respect as long as you continue to act like a loser. You're nothing but a liability in this office." Marcus felt anger rising in him. He couldn't stay in the shadows any longer, unwilling to let this madness continue. Every time he tried to speak his mind, Henderson made him feel small and worthless. Now he was ready to fight for his dignity. "I don't care what you think," he shouted, his voice reverberating through the conference room like a thunderstorm. "I'm not here to be your target. I'm here to work and contribute to the company." This time his colleagues looked at him with surprise. Some of them started to rise, but no one dared to intervene. Henderson, displeased, glared at him with hatred. "You will pay for this," he said through clenched teeth. Like a hissing snake, "I will do everything in my power to show you that you have no right to be here." At that moment, Marcus felt his body fill with adrenaline. He was not going to go down without a fight. "Try it," he shouted back, unable to contain his emotions. "I'm not going to let you behave like this anymore." The meeting ended, and the atmosphere in the room was tense. Henderson, angry, turned and walked out, leaving a shocked team behind him. Marcus, though scared, was relieved that he had not given up. With each passing minute, as the voices died down, he realized it was time to act. Henderson would no longer humiliate him, and perhaps it was time to join forces with those who were still willing to support him. On that day, as the world around him crumbled, Marcus took a step toward his freedom. He knew that he would never allow anyone to degrade him again, and that ultimately this battle would not only be his own, but a battle for everyone who had ever experienced prejudice and hatred. Marcus sat in his office, still processing the aftermath of the recent scene. His heart was pounding with excitement, but he also felt a spark of hope igniting inside him. Perhaps it was time to not just remain silent about the bias and humiliation, but to take action. If he wanted to change this toxic atmosphere, he needed to go to the highest levels of management. However, this step required caution, especially given that his rival held a significant position in the company. That day, when he returned home, Marcus thought about how he should approach the issue. He knew that the CEO, Mr. Cartwright, was a man who valued honesty and openness, and although he did not know what was going on in his company, Marcus felt that he should try. The next day, when the office had quieted down a bit, he went to the CEO's office. It wasn't easy. The very thought of meeting him made Marcus nervous, but he knew it had to be done. He had no other choice. As he approached the door, he was overcome with excitement. He knocked and heard an inviting voice inside. "Come in." Marcus opened the door and walked into the office. Mr. Cartwright was sitting behind a huge desk, engrossed in the paperwork in front of him. He looked up, and Marcus saw interest in his eyes. "Hello, Marcus. How are you?" the CEO asked with a friendly smile. "Hello, Mr. Cartwright," Marcus replied, trying to sound confident. "I have something important I'd like to talk to you about." The CEO nodded, showing that he was listening. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Marcus took a deep breath and collected his thoughts. He knew he had to find the right words to convey his feelings without causing a negative reaction from the CEO. "I have encountered some difficulties at work in recent months," he began cautiously. "I noticed that there are certain problems in the company concerning interaction between employees, and this may have a negative impact on the overall climate in the team." Cartwright raised an eyebrow skeptically. "What do you mean?" Marcus knew he had to be careful not to give himself away. "Well, I think some employees don't feel comfortable in the team. There are certain situations that create bias and tension, especially in the communication between us." The CEO listened to him attentively, and this gave Marcus confidence. He continued, "I don't want to talk about specific people, but it seems to me that if we don't solve these problems, it could lead to a greater gap in the team and even the loss of talented employees." Mr. Cartwright leaned forward, his face serious. "Are you saying that there is racism or discrimination in the company?" Marcus felt anger brewing inside him. He knew it was important to tell the truth, even if it was difficult. "Yes, that's right," he said, trying to remain calm. "I've seen how some colleagues treat each other, how some decisions are made without taking into account the opinions of all employees. I myself have become a victim of such situations." The CEO frowned, his expression changing. "And what do you propose?" Marcus was prepared for this question. He knew he needed to offer solutions, not just complain. "I think we should hold team trainings on diversity and inclusion," he suggested. "This will help us create a friendlier atmosphere and improve communication within the team." Cartwright seemed to consider his words. "That's a reasonable suggestion. I'd like to know more about what's going on. Could you elaborate on what you mean?" Marcus felt like he had made the right move. He began to talk about how Henderson was demeaning employees, how some colleagues avoided communicating with those who were different from them, and how important it was to give everyone a chance to express their opinion. Every word he said brought them closer to understanding the problem, and he could see that the CEO was beginning to realize the seriousness of the situation. I will definitely consider your suggestions and hold a meeting with the team. Thank you for your courage to share this information, Cartwright said, his voice softening. We must do everything we can to create a better environment for everyone. Marcus felt a surge of hope. In that moment, he realized that his voice had been heard and that he was not alone in this struggle. Thank you, Mr. Cartwright, he replied, feeling the weight on his shoulders ease a little. I hope I can do my part to make things better. The CEO nodded, and a look of understanding and support appeared on his face. We all need to work to create a more inclusive and respectful environment, he said. You've done the right thing, and I appreciate your candor. Marcus left the CEO's office feeling like he had taken the first step toward change. He knew there was still work to do, but now he had an ally, someone who could make a difference. Perhaps his struggle was not in vain. At that moment he felt stronger, and with each passing minute the desire to continue the fight for his dignity and the respect of others grew within him. Now he knew that his voice mattered, and he was not going to remain silent. Marcus couldn't help but feel nervous when rumors began circulating around the office about an unscheduled inspection by the CEO. Mr. Cartwright seemed determined to make a surprise visit to gauge the atmosphere in the company. For Marcus, this was an opportunity to show what was really going on and finally put an end to the humiliation he and his colleagues had suffered from Henderson. The day of the inspection arrived and Marcus felt the tension rising. He tried to concentrate on his work, but the thought that his father might see everything that was happening was bothering him. Every minute he listened to the footsteps outside the door, expecting the CEO to appear. When Cartwright entered the office, the room fell silent. His colleagues exchanged glances, wondering what exactly he was doing there. The CEO looked stern, but also focused. He walked around the office, carefully studying his surroundings, and seemed to be searching for something specific. Henderson, noticing the approach of his superiors, immediately changed his posture, trying to portray confidence. Mr. Cartwright, he began. I'm glad to see you. We're just working on a project that I'm sure will impress you. Cartwright nodded, his expression unreadable. I've come to do a little inspection, he said, without revealing his true purpose. I need to know how things are going and get a feel for the team atmosphere. Marcus felt his heart pound as he watched Henderson try to put on a good show, trying to create the illusion of well-being, but there was no confidence in his voice. The CEO began to inspect the workstations, stopping to talk to colleagues. He asked questions about projects, work methods, and the team atmosphere. In response to his questions, employees, including Marcus, tried to speak as honestly as possible, taking every opportunity to share their concerns. I've learned that you're having some communication issues, Cartwright said to a group of employees, including Marcus. I'd like to know how you're feeling about the team environment. Marcus, gathering his courage, decided to speak out. We try to work as a team, but sometimes there is a feeling that some colleagues feel uncomfortable. I have noticed that some of us avoid communication for fear of being ridiculed or humiliated. Cartwright listened carefully, then nodded to confirm that he understood. And you connect this with your manager's behavior? He asked, not hiding his interest. Marcus realized that this moment could be decisive. Yes, I think it is related. There are cases where a manager shows bias and disrespect to some employees, which creates tension in the team. Several colleagues standing nearby supported him, throwing approving glances. I hear you, Cartwright said, his voice becoming more serious. This requires attention. Henderson, watching what was happening, began to sweat. He was clearly nervous and tried to block Marcus. But, Mr. Cartwright, I do everything I can to make our project successful, he began, his voice shaking. I don't think that's my management style. Leadership style? The CEO interrupted, his voice firm. Let's not get off topic. I came here to understand what's really going on. Cartwright continued to look around the office, looking at documents on desks and meeting with various employees. He could feel the tension in the air, and it became clear to him that the atmosphere was far from healthy. Cartwright soon walked up to Henderson's office and knocked on the door. The manager, startled, looked up and saw his boss. Mr. Henderson, can I speak for a minute? Cartwright asked as he entered the office. Of course, Mr. Cartwright, Henderson replied, trying to hide his excitement. As soon as the doors closed, Marcus felt the tension reach a critical point. He wondered what was going to happen behind those doors. The CEO began asking Henderson questions about his management methods and how he interacted with his team. You must be aware that the team environment needs to be supportive and inclusive. Do you have any mechanisms in place to ensure that this happens? Cartwright asked. Henderson, realizing that his behavior was in serious question, began to justify himself. I am sure that my team works well, and I just need to give them more time to adapt. I do everything for their development. Cartwright looked at him incredulously. I've heard something completely different from your employees. His voice was stern. I'm sure you understand that your role is not only to supervise the work, but also to create conditions in which everyone will feel like a valuable member of the team. Marcus realized at that moment that his confidence was rising with every word the CEO said. The inspection had not gone as Henderson had planned. Cartwright finished talking to the manager and walked out of his office, feeling that he now had enough information to act. He looked at the assembled employees and, seeing their tense faces, decided that it was time to open everyone's eyes to the real problems in the company. I appreciate all of your candid answers, he said loudly so that everyone could hear. I'm going to have a few meetings to discuss how we can improve our corporate culture and make it more respectful and inclusive for everyone. These words sounded like musical notes of hope for Marcus and his colleagues. They felt that maybe it was finally time to change things for the better. Since their conversation with the CEO, Marcus had seen a spark of hope rekindled in the hearts of his colleagues. They now knew that their voices had been heard, and their fight for justice could lead to real change in their company. Tensions were rising in the office, and the employees felt that the situation had reached its breaking point. Every day they witnessed the humiliation that Marcus, a black employee, suffered from his manager, Henderson. But that day, something unusual was happening. The CEO, Mr. Cartwright, was in the office, watching everything that was happening. When Henderson entered the common area, he seemed ready for another attack. His colleagues froze, sensing that something negative was about to happen. They knew that something terrible was about to happen, and no one could predict how far their manager would go. Hey, Marcus, Henderson began, addressing his subordinate with disdain. Would you finally realize that in order to work for this company, you have to be at least a little bit up to standard? Don't you think, with your level of education, you're in the wrong place? An oppressive silence fell over the room upon hearing this. People exchanged anxious glances, realizing that this moment could be critical. But Marcus had one more hope. He knew that the CEO was watching all of this. Maybe you should apply to college to improve your chances instead of just sitting here making your stupid mistakes. Henderson continued, not noticing that his words were falling on the ears of those who actually understood how unfair he was being. Marcus didn't want to fight back, but his anger was growing. Every put down, every word Henderson uttered tore at his soul. He knew the CEO was watching, and that gave him strength. Why would you even think about promotion? You're just not up to par, the manager continued, ignoring the fact that he had already crossed the line into not only prejudice, but racism. At this moment, Cartwright, who had been at a distance, came closer, and his face reflected anger. Henderson, he said with cold determination, drawing the attention of the entire team, stop humiliating your employees. What you're doing is unacceptable. Everyone in the office froze in anticipation. Henderson, realizing that his actions had been noticed, tried to pull himself together, but it was too late. But, Mr. Cartwright, he began, but was interrupted. You don't understand anything about leadership, the CEO snapped. Your job is to support your team, not suppress them. And if you can't understand that, we're going to have to discuss your future with this company. Marcus felt a flood of emotions wash over him, relief and anger all at once. He knew his moment of justice had arrived, and he wasn't going to take any more humiliation. I can't stay in the shadows any longer, he said loudly, gathering his remaining courage. Every day I see you humiliating me, doing it publicly and with racist overtones. This is unacceptable. Henderson, realizing his shame had been exposed, tried to redirect the conversation again. You shouldn't take it personally, he muttered. I'm just trying to help you become a better person. No amount of help justifies racism. Marcus snapped. You have no right to humiliate me. And just because you're a manager doesn't give you the authority to do it in the workplace. The CEO nodded in support, and Marcus felt a surge of strength fill him with courage. Cartwright turned to Henderson, his face hard. Not only are you showing a lack of respect for your employee, but you are also creating a toxic atmosphere that is harmful to the entire team. If you cannot change your behavior, I will leave you no choice but to take serious action. Colleagues watched the standoff, and many of them began to feel relief. The moment when Henderson was forced to face the consequences of his actions was long overdue. "I beg you, do not interfere in our affairs," Henderson said with increasing aggression, but now his words sounded weak and unconvincing. "I'm intervening because it's important," Cartwright said, his voice firmer. "We all have to work as a team, and no one should suffer because of bias and hatred." As if the clouds had parted, the office became silent, and Marcus felt that all their suffering was beginning to bear fruit. He breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that not only the CEO was on his side, but also his colleagues. "We must all demand respect," he added, addressing his colleagues. "No threats or humiliation should be part of our workday." The CEO nodded in agreement and turned to the team and said, "I will keep you informed of what is happening. We will create conditions in which everyone will feel valued and respected." At that moment, the entire team, including Marcus, felt that their struggle had not been in vain. Together, they could confront bias and change the corporate culture. Each of them became part of the change that was so necessary to create a better working environment. The moment when justice was served opened a new chapter in their lives, and although it was just the beginning, they felt that they were now together, and this gave them strength. The moment was tense, as if the entire office was holding its breath in anticipation of the outcome. Henderson had just been publicly condemned by the CEO for his humiliation, but no one in the room expected the situation to take such an unexpected turn. Marcus, feeling supported and confident in justice, stood with his head held high despite all the humiliation he had endured. The CEO, Mr. Cartwright, turned slowly to face the rest of the staff, his voice confident and decisive. "It's time to tell you all a very important truth," he began. There was not only severity in his voice, but also some hidden pain. "For several weeks, I have been watching what has been happening in this office. I knew there was trouble, but I did not expect it to go this far." Henderson, standing nearby, couldn't hide his confusion. He didn't know where this conversation was going. Looking around, he tried to force a weak smile, hoping that the CEO was simply trying to lighten the mood. "You all see this man," Cartwright continued, gesturing at Marcus. "You may have thought of him as a simple employee, perhaps even underestimated him based on his appearance or his position in the company, but you didn't know the most important thing." At this point, a tense silence fell over the room. Marcus's colleagues, who had previously been paralyzed by fear and awkwardness, did not even dare to whisper. Everyone was waiting for what the CEO would say. Cartwright said loudly and clearly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, "My only son." Henderson went pale. He instantly felt the world crumble beneath his feet. His eyes widened in shock, and he froze in place, as if paralyzed. All the times he had insulted, humiliated, and neglected Marcus began to flash through his mind. It was now clear that every word he had said could have disastrous consequences. The office staff froze in amazement. Many could not believe their ears. Colleagues who had previously tried to stay away from Marcus began to realize that they had been judging him solely by his appearance and status, without thinking about who he might really be. "I allowed Marcus to work here as an employee because I believed his ability and hard work spoke for themselves," Cartwright continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want him to get preferential treatment because of our relationship, but what I've seen over the past few weeks isn't just bias. It's pure racism and abuse of power." Henderson tried to say something, his voice trembling. "Mr. Cartwright, I didn't know." But the CEO raised his hand, interrupting him. "You weren't supposed to know who he was, Henderson," Cartwright said, his tone cold and ruthless. "That's the point. No one should suffer in the workplace, especially because of the color of their skin or where they come from, no matter whose son or daughter they are. Everyone deserves respect." Marcus felt the tension he'd been holding inside for months begin to melt away. He looked at his father and knew that the truth had finally come out. Now everyone knew that he wasn't just a black employee who'd had bad luck with his boss. He was the CEO's son and, more importantly, a man who deserved respect like everyone else. Marcus's colleagues began to look at each other, their faces reflecting a mixture of embarrassment and regret. Each of them knew that they had witnessed an injustice, but no one intervened. Now they had to face this fact. My son has shown incredible resilience and fortitude, Cartwright added, his eyes meeting Marcus's. He has endured things no one should have to endure, but now that is over. Henderson, feeling his world was crumbling, tried to justify himself. I didn't mean anything bad. I just wanted him to improve his results. I didn't know that. You didn't know that? Cartwright interrupted, his voice steely. That his father is the CEO, and that somehow justifies your actions? You were biased and demeaned him based on the color of his skin. Don't think that will go unpunished. Henderson tried to say something else, but the words caught in his throat. He knew it was over. The office was depressingly quiet, and everyone knew the moment of truth had arrived. Marcus was no longer just an invisible employee, he was the CEO's son, and a man who had proven his worth through hard work, patience, and resilience, despite all the humiliation he had endured. Now it's the company's turn to draw conclusions from what happened. Manager Henderson seemed speechless. He stood there dumbfounded, as if he had just been dealt a blow that was hard to recover from. His face was growing paler with each passing second, and his eyes were filled with pure terror. The CEO's words were still echoing in his head. Marcus is my son. Those few words hit him like a bolt from the blue. It felt like reality was beginning to crumble around him, and he couldn't believe what he had just learned. Everything he had done, every put down, mockery, threat was now coming back at him with such force that he couldn't breathe. Henderson tried to maintain control of the situation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his career at the company was now hanging by a thread. I didn't know, he muttered in a breaking voice, looking at the CEO, but Cartwright didn't show the slightest sympathy. The CEO's heavy gaze was directed straight at Henderson. There was so much contempt in it that the manager felt really sick. You weren't supposed to know, Cartwright repeated, his voice as cold as a knife blade. You didn't need to know whose son he was to act like a human being. It shouldn't matter at all. You were supposed to treat him with the respect you treat all your subordinates. Henderson began to tug at the hem of his shirt, his mind racing like a caged animal. He realized that he had misused all his power and authority, that every action, every word he had said had been wrong. How could he have been so wrong? How could he have treated someone he didn't even know so cruelly? I didn't think it was that important. He began to justify himself, but his voice sounded pathetic and unconvincing. Cartwright interrupted him again, cutting off any attempt at justification. Is it important? What matters is how you treat your employees. You allowed yourself to be mocked and humiliated only because you thought you could. You thought that power gave you the right, but you were wrong, and this mistake will cost you dearly. Henderson's eyes began to dart around the room. He looked for support among his colleagues, the same ones who had laughed with him at Marcus's expense, but now they looked away. No one dared to intervene or even nod in his direction. Everyone knew that the situation was out of control. I can fix this, Henderson said quickly, his voice shaking and his words growing more desperate. Give me a chance. I'm sorry. I didn't know who he was. If I'd known, and that was supposed to change anything? Cartwright interrupted sharply, frowning. You're not apologizing for your behavior, but for not knowing who he really was. You're not remorseful for humiliating a man, you're just afraid of the consequences. It was a dead giveaway. Henderson realized he really had no arguments left. He was only apologizing because he knew who Marcus was. His remorse wasn't real. It was a panicked desire to save his career, his reputation, himself, but now it was all useless. I never thought. Henderson tried to say something, but he felt that his words no longer meant anything. He understood that in the eyes of his colleagues and management, he had become a pitiful figure, broken under the weight of his own mistakes. Marcus, standing next to his father, finally spoke. It's not that you didn't know who I was, it's that you allowed yourself to think that it was okay to treat people like that. It was your choice, Henderson. Every time you put me down, it was a conscious choice. Marcus's words echoed in the room, and each of the employees felt the weight of them. Henderson tried to respond, but he had no more excuses. He understood that he had lost. After the truth was revealed, the atmosphere in the office changed. People who had once laughed with Henderson and Marcus now avoided their former boss's gaze. Tension hung in the air like a thick fog. No one knew what the CEO would say or do next, but one thing was clear: Henderson no longer had any power. CEO Cartwright stood before the team, his eyes expressing only cold determination. Everyone knew he had no intention of forgiving or showing any softness at this moment. He had just witnessed his son, Marcus, being humiliated and insulted because of prejudice, and now it was time for payback. I cannot allow this type of behavior to exist in our company, Cartwright said loudly and clearly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. No amount of apology or justification can undo what happened here. A manager who uses his power to humiliate and insult others has no business being in that position. Henderson froze. There was a look of despair in his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Just recently he had been a man confident in his power, in control of everything in this office, and now everything was crumbling before his eyes. Henderson, Cartwright continued, you are out of office today. You are no longer a manager. You will no longer use your power to humiliate people. And if I could, I would rid the company of your presence entirely. But under our rules, I cannot fire you immediately without a hearing. You will remain here, but not as a manager. Henderson, pale and visibly dejected, felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He realized that he could never return to his old life, to his power and influence. The colleagues who had once respected him as a boss, or at least pretended to, now looked upon him with contempt. He had lost everything. From now on, you'll be doing the most basic and menial tasks that you've previously delegated to others. Cartwright continued with icy calm. I want you to feel what it's like to be at the bottom of the corporate ladder, with no protection, no privileges. Let's see how you like being in the place where you've kept others for so long. Now Henderson was not only out of office, he was the object of contempt and glee among his peers. People who had once been afraid to stand up to him now showed no sign of hiding their contempt. They watched him fall with pleasure, for he now found himself in the same vulnerable position that Marcus and his subordinates had once occupied. Henderson, trying to maintain some dignity, forced a tight smile and nodded, though inside he was burning with humiliation. He knew he would never go back to his old life, to the privileges and respect he had once had. I'll do everything I can to prove I'm right, he muttered weakly, more to himself than to those around him. But not a single glance in the office expressed sympathy or support. Henderson was a nobody now. The employees who had previously kept silent under his pressure now openly despised him. Those who had previously laughed with him at Marcus now showed cold detachment or even displeasure. This was the beginning of his humiliating fall. Every day at work would be a reminder of what he had lost. Henderson would be forced to do the most routine and unpleasant work, the very same work he had previously contemptuously handed over to his subordinates. Every time he met the eyes of his former colleagues, he would see only ridicule and contempt. For Henderson, this was the worst punishment of all, to find himself at the bottom of the very system he had so loved to use to humiliate others. Now he was the object of that system, and he would have to endure all the humiliations he had inflicted on others for so long. For Marcus, this was a moment of truth and justice. Now his work and his dignity will no longer be questioned or humiliated. The atmosphere in the office changed after the stunning fall of manager Henderson. What happened was a powerful lesson for every employee who witnessed the drama. No one could pretend that racial slurs and put-downs were simply part of a tough corporate culture. The events unfolding before them exposed a rotten core of bias and abuse of power that had been quietly growing within their workforce for years. After Henderson lost his position and was relegated to menial tasks, people began to look at him and their own behavior differently. Those who had once laughed with him now felt remorse. They realized that their silence, and sometimes participation in the ridicule, made them complicit in the insults and humiliations. One of the employees, Sarah, who had previously tried to stay out of conflict, now felt a crushing sense of shame. She recalled moments when she had seen Marcus being humiliated, but had never intervened. In her heart, she knew that what she had done was wrong, but fear for her own career and a reluctance to confront a powerful manager kept her silent. Now, watching Henderson hunched over doing simple tasks, she realized that her inaction had cost another man his dignity. It was a lesson that stuck with her for the rest of her life. Silence in the face of injustice is a form of participation. Sarah resolved to never again let anyone else be treated unfairly. Marcus's colleagues, who had previously avoided him or even laughed at him, now began to approach him with apologies. Many admitted their guilt, saying that they were afraid of losing their jobs or becoming another target for Henderson, and so they did not intervene. Marcus accepted these apologies, although a residue of pain and disappointment remained inside him for a long time. He realized that people can be weak and give in to fears, but his respect for them will never return in full. CEO Cartwright called the entire office together for a major meeting a few days after the incident. He stood before his employees, realizing that his company had to make major changes to ensure that such an incident never happened again. "We've all seen how bias and disrespect can destroy a team," he began, his voice firm and serious. "I can't go back in time and fix what's happened, but we must learn from it. There is no room for discrimination here at our company. No one deserves to be treated the way Marcus was treated, and from now on, such behavior will be punished in the harshest possible way." Cartwright paused to give people time to absorb his words. "I want each of you to remember that strength does not lie in pushing the weak. Strength lies in supporting each other, regardless of skin color, gender, or status. This is the only way we can create a truly successful and respected company." His words struck a chord. People realized they could no longer ignore injustice or hide behind excuses. Every employee now understood that their actions, even their silence, had consequences. Marcus remained a quiet observer of everything that was happening. He saw how the behavior of his colleagues changed, how the tension gradually subsided, giving way to attentiveness and caution in communication. But most importantly, he saw that this lesson remained in everyone's hearts. Now that the office was filled with a new atmosphere of respect and awareness, every day was different. People became more mindful of their words and actions, realizing that any manifestation of discrimination could destroy human dignity. This incident became an important lesson for everyone. You can't judge people by their appearance or position. Every person deserves respect, and no manager, regardless of rank, has the right to treat subordinates with arrogance and cruelty. So the situation in the office didn't just change Henderson's destiny, it became a major turning point for all the employees. Changing their outlook on life and work, they realized that each of them is responsible for creating a healthy and respectful atmosphere, where each person has the right to be heard and appreciated for their qualities and merits, and not for their appearance or social status. After the shocking events of Marcus's humiliation and Henderson's fall, the company realized that fundamental changes were needed. CEO Cartwright, himself appalled by what was happening under his nose, decided that firing was not enough. Something deeper was needed to change the corporate culture and prevent similar situations from happening again. The first step was to create a new equality and inclusion department. This department was headed by an experienced specialist brought in from outside the company who had extensive experience in eliminating discrimination in the workplace. Her task was not just to develop rules, but to implement real programs that would help every employee feel respected and protected. At the first meeting with the team, she clearly outlined the company's goal. "We are not just eliminating the consequences, we are creating a new future. From today, every employee will have the opportunity to express their concerns and experiences, and their voice will be heard. We are starting with the basics, respect and equality. These should not just be words, but daily practice for each of you." All staff underwent a series of trainings on anti-bias, cultural awareness, and professional ethics. These events were accompanied by regular meetings where specific steps to improve the corporate culture were discussed. Every employee, from newcomers to senior management, participated in open dialogues where they shared their thoughts and experiences. This created an atmosphere of trust and mutual support. Marcus, who decided to stay with the company despite all the humiliation he had endured, became a symbol of this change. He was not a public figure, but his story inspired other employees. Those who had previously been afraid to speak out saw that justice was possible. Some of his colleagues approached him to thank him for his endurance and courage. They now understood the importance of speaking out against injustice, even if it meant taking risks. Over time, the atmosphere in the office changed. People became more considerate of each other, and the discriminatory jokes and insults that were once part of everyday life disappeared. Employees began to work in a more cohesive team, where each person, regardless of race, gender or social status, felt like an important part of the common cause. The company also introduced regular employee surveys to track their opinions on the working conditions and atmosphere. Any complaints of discrimination or bias were now taken seriously. This helped create a safe environment where everyone could express their concerns without fear of reprisal. In addition, hiring and promotion policies were revised to ensure equal opportunities for all employees. Previously existing informal barriers that favored certain groups were now removed. This allowed the company to attract a more diverse workforce and contributed to increased trust among employees. Soon, these changes began to bear fruit. Not only did the company strengthen its reputation, but its employees' productivity increased. People who had previously felt insecure or oppressed now worked enthusiastically, knowing that their work was valued and their rights were protected. Cartwright himself gave the closing speech at the annual meeting. We all witnessed what happened in our office. But this is not the end. This is just the beginning. We are all learning. We are creating a future where there is no place for racism, humiliation, and bias. We are building a company based on respect and mutual support. Together, we can create an environment where every person feels valued. The company now became an example for others, showing that even after serious mistakes, it is possible to take a step forward and become better. For Marcus and his colleagues, this was not just a new beginning, it was a chance for a future in which fairness and respect are central.